Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's live stream. My name is Lauren Williams, and I am the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow in the Strategic Technologies Program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Our program focuses on the social, economic, and security challenges created by emerging technologies, ranging from AI and semiconductors to spectrum, cybersecurity, space, and everything in between. I'm really delighted to introduce today's discussion on a fascinating new book by CSIS affiliate Dr. Nicholas Wright called Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. And this talk is especially fun for me to moderate since Dr. Wright and I worked together years ago at a different organization. So without further ado, Dr. Nicholas Wright is a neuroscientist and advisor to the Pentagon Joint Staff who researches the brain, technology, and security at University College London, Georgetown University, and the National Defense University here in DC. And of course, he is an adjunct fellow with the CSIS Strategic Technologies Program, has been for several years. He works with governments and the private sector and was a neurology doctor in London and in Oxford. He has been extensively published in leading academic and policy outlets, and his work has been widely covered by major media, including the BBC, the New York Times, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, and The Atlantic. And his new book, Warhead, which we will discuss in detail today, explores the idea that the human brain is built for conflict. Drawing on his expertise in neuroscience, history, and contemporary security challenges, Dr. Wright's book shows how the wiring of our minds shapes the way that wars unfold. What I think makes Warhead especially relevant for us and interesting here at the Strategic Technologies Program is how these insights extend into strategic competition and technology policy, and especially its implications for the use of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies in war. And as one example, as the US and China race to develop and deploy AI systems, the relationship between human cognition and machine intelligence will profoundly influence global security, including in wartime. So with that overview, let's dive right into the conversation. So Nick, you opened Warhead with the provocative idea that the brain is built for conflict. We want you to start by unpacking that for us, but we'd also love to hear how you came to focus on these issues to start.
So Lauren, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And as you said, it's great to meet up again as we were on the same, a few offices apart a few years ago. So thank you so much. So, as you say, originally I was a neurology doctor, so I was treating patients working in Oxford and in London at the National Hospital for Neurology in a place called Queen Square in London. I then spent a number of years using functional brain imaging and computational techniques to look at how humans make decisions. And I did that at Queen Square, and I did that in the lab that DeepMind was spun out of. And it was a really exciting place with, really powerful ideas about how the brain was working. And people like Demis Hassabis were there. And so Demis was, in fact, he and I shared an office for a short period of time whilst he was finishing his PhD and I was starting my PhD. And he was applying all of these ideas, things like AI, and I wanted to apply them to public policy. And so that's when I then went to the organization we worked at, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I really wanted to apply what we were learning about the human brain to one of the most important aspects of strategy, which is strategy about nuclear weapons. And again, people think, what have nuclear weapons got to do with the brain? But as you and I know, yes, there are an enormous number of technical aspects. But if you're thinking about deterrence, if you're thinking about escalation management with nuclear weapons, which you have to do. That's what that's what a lot of nuclear strategy is about. That is fundamentally about understanding the minds of others, shaping how others will decide to act or not act. And so I worked there for a number of years, alongside you for part of that time, and then worked with the Joint Staff and I've worked on a number in the Pentagon, now back in the UK, but worked on these issues for a number of years. And really, I came to write this book because I was really troubled by the fact that so few people in the normal world, very intelligent people, very well-educated people, but outside the Pentagon, outside perhaps some aspects of the Washington bubble and so on, people just really did not think that there was any chance there would be a serious war in the world. And if there was a serious war, they thought there was no chance that the United States and its allies could lose. And I knew from the work I was doing at the Pentagon that just was no longer the case by the time we got to about 2019, 2020. And then, of course, a lot of ideas, and so I started writing this book, and then a lot of, a lot of people started changing their mind, fortunately, around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so that was really, a good example for me of the fact that wars really can happen. We need to understand how and why people fight and why people win and lose wars. So what can the brain tell us about that? So the brain is absolutely central to war. It is the central weapon of war. So throughout history and prehistory, many humans have faced violence, starvation, and other life and death emergencies. And to navigate such life-threatening emergencies, every brain, yours, Lauren, and mine, is built to win or at least survive a fight, right? Human against nature or human against human. And so now if I could ask if your colleagues could very kindly put the slide on. And in the book, what we do is we take a journey through the brain, right? We start from the brainstem down at the base of the brain, and we move through 10 different brain regions, and we end at the frontal pole right at the other end of the brain. Okay. And throughout that brain, every part of our brain is made of survival grade neural machinery, right down from the brainstem all the way to the frontal pole. So if we look at the brainstem, for example, there are regions that are crucial for pain, and pain is useful, right? We need pain as an alert system telling us there's tissue damage. Moving up a bit further are regions that are crucial for fear, and fear is useful, okay, to help us survive threats in dangerous, fast-moving and uncertain environments. A little bit further up, we have maps. Then we have areas for thinking, and that includes thinking what others are thinking of us and how we can try and anticipate others' others' intentions, for example. And when we end our journey at the very other end of the brain, at the frontal pole, that helps us do something that's really, I think wonderful, and that gives me a lot of hope for the future, which is that the frontal pole is vital for us to think about our own thinking. Okay, so you, Lauren, there can have a thought, and then you can introspect, you can think about that own thought, right? Your own thought that you've just had. Now, that's something that we humans can do. We can explicitly, using language and other things, we can explicitly think about our own thinking. And that's enormously powerful. That's a central part of wisdom and always has been. And wisdom is going to be crucial when you're thinking about war, because wisdom is about helping see ourselves in the world so that we can make wiser choices that help us live better. So I think that we need to know about the brain, and we need to know about the brain in order to understand why humans fight, lose, and win wars. And that self-knowledge, I think, is enormously powerful. And I'm optimistic that we can use that self-knowledge for good, and that we can use that self-knowledge to save civilization.
No, that's all incredibly helpful, Nick, and I like how your chapter structures in your book are organized, kind of essentially as you showed us in a visual form, a walk through the brain, and as you've kind of given us the overview, which parts of the brain contribute to the ways that we think and act. So I want to pick up on the last point that you made, which is that your hope that the brain can be used for well, it can be used for negative, for war, but also for good, and for peace. And you, of course, in the book call the brain the central weapon of war. So I'm wondering if you can kind of expand on that and talk to the audience about the dual role of the brain as a central weapon of war, but how can it be used as an instrument of peace as well?
Sure. I mean, so let's think about why the brain is a central weapon of war, and I am going to come on to peace. Don't worry, I love peace. But let's think about why the brain is the central weapon of war. So in May 1940, there were two armies that faced each other, right? The German army and the French and British defending France. So the Allies had more men, more trained men, more guns, more tanks, more planes. Okay, but the Germans, unfortunately, had asked how they could harness the human brain's capacities for shock, creativity, guile, will, daring, and skill, alongside the technologies of their time to win wars. And they'd done that much more effectively than Britain and France had, certainly on land. And they were able to surprise and decide faster than the Allies. And in less than 7 weeks after their offensive started in the West, their blitzkrieg, right, that started in the West, Hitler's horses were clattering up the Champs-Elysees in a victory parade, right? So if we do not harness that opening, those human capabilities to fight, then we will lose, even if we have material superiority. And it's also important to remember that German effectiveness created the opening, but there was actually far more to it than that. So the Germans advanced so far through an enemy with more trained men, guns, tanks, and planes because the French will to fight collapsed. Right? There was no particular reason why Hitler's cavalry was clattering up the Champs-Elysees within 7 weeks of the start of that offensive. And it's very important to remember again that is fundamentally psychological. And so I'd say that in our time, the democracies must be the ones who are harnessing that central weapon of war, the human brain. Now, that said, of course, the human brain is not only there for war, it's there for, art, it's there for all sorts of things, family, it's there also for reconciliation. Peace and reconciliation are every bit as natural to humans as fighting or conflict, right? Every bit as natural. And we must remember that. And it is natural for us to reconcile with others, for example, after a conflict, often. But we mustn't forget that both those sides of humanity are features of simply how we are. And if we forget that, then we're going to be in big trouble.
Absolutely. And in the narrative that you draw out around World War II, which I think is really powerful in the book as well, you also, and you noted it in your explanation just now, you talk about the importance of kind of intangibles like resolve and courage, including when describing, how the British were able to ultimately kind of fight with all of those qualities. So that's another, I think, kind of interesting element to draw out, and even with potentially inferior materiel and kind of the tangibles to the Germans, for example. Those intangible kind of brain-driven characteristics bolstered the British in their fight in the context of World War II.
Yeah, and I mean, but it's very important to remember that actually, pretty much all of the great powers lasted for years in World War II, and the Chinese did as well. So, it was just last week that Xi Jinping had the big military parade to mark 80 years since the end of World War II for China. And the Chinese, actually, their World War II started before World War II did, even for Britain and France. And the Chinese nationalist forces fought very bravely, for example, in the battle for Shanghai. And then they and then they fought on for many, many years. And in fact, unfortunately, the Germans also fought on for many years. And I think this is another thing when we come back to thinking about peace. So what is peace? Or how do we create peace? And we've got to remember that the very last time that we had a general war between all the great powers, which was World War II, the Germans, by June 1944, there was no chance they were going to win. There'd been D-Day in the West, had succeeded, and there was a gigantic Soviet-Russian operation in the East called Operation Bagration that eviscerated the key German armies in the east. And yet the Germans fought on. Even after that, the Germans fought, even after those things had succeeded, the Germans fought on until for longer than France lasted in the entire war. Okay, so resolve is something that, you know, we could say the good guys have, if you want to say there are good guys, but also that, you know, the other side can also have. And we've got to remember that peace involves military victory. Now, that's necessary sometimes, but it's not always sufficient. And so that's why, for example, you have someone like Churchill. Churchill said, you know, in victory, magnanimity. If you read his history of World War II, that's literally right at the very front as a moral of the tale. In victory, magnanimity, because he knew that you both need victory and you also need magnanimity, because those are the two sides of the coin. You know, we're built for conflict and we're also built for reconciliation.
Absolutely. No, there's a lot to draw on from there. So I want to stick a pin in a related conversation that your book raises around how we should think about advanced technologies and their role in war, and maybe comparing that to, or in context of how we think about the brain's role in war.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to come back to that. But while we're on the brain itself, you also, one of the interesting things you talk about are brain models. So can you explain that to the audience? What is a brain model and how does it guide our decisions?
Yeah, so every animal in the world that has a brain, it has a, like, why does it have that brain? It has a brain in order to link, so it receives information from the senses and it tries to link that. It has a model that links that to actions that help it achieve its goals. Okay, so a model is simply something that can help you link senses to actions that help you achieve your goals. So for a fly, you know, it could be very simple things about, you know, getting to food and flying and avoiding and tussling with other flies. They actually, fruit flies that you might find in your kitchen at home near your fruit bowl, they actually fight duels against each other with tussling and all sorts of fencing of legs. And female fruit flies like the headbutt. That is the classic female fruit fly Drosophila maneuver. So they have models that link their senses to actions that help them achieve their goals, which are fundamentally to survive, to maintain order within their own bodies, and also to successfully reproduce. Now, you can then go up to you know, all sorts of other animals, you know, small birds hopping around in my garden, or chimpanzees, or dogs, or humans. And humans obviously have massively more sophisticated models, but the basic ideas are the same. And what we have in our brain is models upon models upon models. And those models work together as an orchestra of models to make the symphony within which we live our everyday lives.
Sorry, got stuck on mute there. But no, I think that's really, really interesting. And one, I'm sure we all learned, myself included, about a lot about fruit flies and how they interact with each other. But I think it's a great example to broaden out and think about the multiple models that are always ongoing and maybe in conflict, maybe working together in human brains, and you know, of course, creating imperfect decision making. So that's really, really helpful. Okay, so can we go back to advanced technologies and how you talk about those things in the book, and including how you think about them in the context of the kind of central importance that you place on the brain?
So, I mean, let's take as an example models that we have in our brain for space. Right? So we have in our brain models that are not metaphors. You don't literally have you don't metaphorically have a map of the world in your brain. You literally have a map of the world in your brain. Okay, so and this was pioneered by a chap called John O'Keefe, who discovered place cells a few decades ago, and he won the Nobel Prize in 2014 for this. He was at my university in London at UCL. And what John O'Keefe discovered is you basically implant electrodes in the brains of rodents, and you get those rodents to move around, and you can work out exactly where those rodents are by just reading out where they are in their internal map, in their hippocampus. Right, and then we actually have much more sophisticated maps than that, involving things called grid cells. And what's remarkable about these maps is these maps can actually map not just space, but they can also map time, and they can also map very abstract conceptual environments. So, for example, you and I both know people who are sort of cyber warriors, if you wanted to call them that, or words to that effect. Other people who work in the 3 dimensions of space with different orbits and so on and so forth, who might be, you know, thought of as space warriors, essentially. They will have maps that literally represent those environments, which is really quite remarkable. Now, how does that relate to sort of new technologies? So Demis hassabis. So these maps are in a brain region called the hippocampal entorhinal cortex. And that brain region is also crucial for memory. So Demis hassabis, who won last year's Nobel Prize. So what did he actually study? What did he do his PhD in? So Demis did his PhD on the hippocampus and how the hippocampus use it. So it's used for memories. It's vital for how we store memories about the world. So I remember you, Lauren. I remember a variety of things that occurred when you and I worked together. I have those memories, right? My hippocampus was very important for storing those memories. But it's also good for imagining things in the future, right? So we have memories, not for the past, but for the future, right? So to help us navigate possible futures, to create models of futures that could occur. And so what did Demis actually do his PhD in? So Demis did his PhD looking at the hippocampal entorhinal cortex, looking at memories, and in particular, looking at how that region helps us imagine potential futures. Okay. And if you look a lot of the way that AI has developed, for example, so the other that has been inspired. I'm not saying people directly read out from the brain exactly how to build an NVIDIA chip. That's not what I'm saying. But actually, how the brain works has been central to how AI has developed. So if you look at the other person who won last year's Nobel Prize for AI, essentially was Geoffrey Hinton. So Geoffrey Hinton was also at Queen Square in London, right, before he went off to Toronto. And he was there. He set up the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit, right, which is where my second supervisor was when I was doing my PhD. And that, again, he was interested in the brain, and he worked very hard, very cleverly, using mathematics and a wide variety of different computational techniques to understand the brain. And from a lot of that work, we now have a lot of the breakthroughs. So he was the key chap who had the breakthrough in 2012 with the ImageNet work that I'm sure a lot of your listeners who work on AI will be familiar with. A lot of it, I think it's basically impossible to understand where we are today with AI without understanding that a lot of the key players fundamentally, are grounded in understanding or trying to understand, and in some cases recreate or even surpass the human brain.
No, that is really helpful. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So in some ways, or maybe not, maybe entirely, we can't, understand emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, without understanding the brain, and maybe vice versa. So I think that's really, really helpful.
And just say the other thing, and I think you're absolutely right. And the other thing is that whatever new technologies we create, there will always be humans who are going to be involved. For as long as, the moment there are no humans involved in a war, or there are no humans involved in technology, we're all completely doomed, right? So there will always be humans involved, however sophisticated technology. Somewhere, right, like right now, President Donald Trump, it's his finger that is on the metaphorical button. His brain that is in control of that finger, that metaphorical, that finger. And that it's the same with Vladimir Putin in Russia.
No, that's a great a great concrete example because I wanted to draw out or draw out from you, this idea that war does it hinges on weapons, but it's to your point, it's decisions and decision makers who ultimately use those weapons, and they're often making decisions that, or if not always, under pressure. So how can neuroscience, how does your expertise in neuroscience help us understand how and why leaders make catastrophic decisions, or just decisions in general, but also how those might sometimes be catastrophic mistakes in conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think the remarkable thing is that we're able to function at all. You're able to eat breakfast in the morning and then get up and operate all sorts of sophisticated computers, and then speak to somebody who's thousands of miles away in London about brain research and war. It's remarkable the things that you can do, and if anyone could create your brain, that would be they would become the most famous scientist in the world. So, the human brain is utterly remarkable, but obviously the human brain can't do everything. So bear in mind it operates on about 20 watts. That's a dim incandescent light bulb. It's only I think about 3 pounds in weight. It inevitably has limitations. And so one of those limitations is if we think about planning forwards, right? So if you and I were playing, so what did Demis win his? He won he was in charge of AlphaGo that beat the world's greatest Go player of the moment back in 2016. So Go, you have this issue of computational explosion, combinatorial explosion. So there are just simply too many possibilities. I place a piece, then you place a piece, then I place a piece, then you place a piece, and so on. There are just simply too many possibilities for that to be tackled with brute force. So inevitably, our brains have to operate, and that's in a really constrained environment of a board game involving black and white stones, right, and a grid. So in the real world, which is a lot more complex, massively more complex, then how can our brains cope with that? So inevitably, our brains use models, and those models have to use effective shortcuts, right? They have to use effective ways of dealing with the world that is just too complex for us to cope with by brute force analysis. So, for example, if you are with perception, right? However good, now when we it seems natural. So how does perception work, right? How does your perception, how does Lauren Williams's perception work, your visual perception? So you think that you're or I don't know exactly what you think, but a common sense idea, and it seems entirely plausible to me now as I pick up this cup and have a sip. It seems entirely plausible to me that the cup, I receive light coming from the cup. When I look at the cup, I can see light coming from the cup, and then that light hits my retina, and then it gets taken by nerves up into the brain, and then within the brain it gets more, processed more and more and more, and then in the end it's like on some kind of passive television set in my brain. I then see there's a cup, and I can pick it up and I can take a drink from it. I can do what I want with it. But that's not actually how our perceptual system works. We know that that cannot be the case because there's just far too much information coming in the whole time for us to conceivably process. And in addition to that, it is just impossible that we're seeing like a passive we're just seeing a passive TV set in the brain. So to give you an example, only the very center of your retina has the types of receptors in it that are really good for fine detail and color, right? But the rest of the image, if you just keep your eyes still and sort of think about what's around you, like I've got green walls in my office, I can still see them as green. Now, it's not possible that green is coming up from the light signals sent from the walls. What I'm actually perceiving is a controlled model of the world. So, and that involves my expectations. It's controlled by my expectations about how things work in the world, and where I expect things to be. So, for example, on you have two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. It's a face. You're nodding. I expect that because you're not Indian, because in India sometimes nodding is wrong, and that But I'm expecting you're saying yes, right? I have expectations about how the world works, and then in addition to that, it is updated. My controlled perceptual model of the world is updated by what I'm receiving from my senses. But I'm actually seeing a controlled perceptual model of the world. So every new technology we have, those we will still make fundamental errors, because we will still other people can deceive us by manipulating our expectations, manipulating the sensory updating that we're doing, right? So I'm involved in things like military discussions about things like military deception, and that is fundamentally about playing with our perceptual models. And there is no AI that can ever remove the fog of war, partly because any capable adversary will deliberately try and manipulate that fog of war through concealment, through cheating, through confusing us, and all the rest of it. So that's one example of where we can go wrong by using our models. Another example is we have all these futures branching out. Okay, like we're playing Go, we have all these futures branching out. We can't possibly analyze all of those potential futures. So one thing we can do, we have these heuristics, we have these rules of thumb that, for example, we only look a few moves into the future. Another thing is we often try, if there's something big and nasty, like on one path in our decision tree stretching forward in one potential future, we often then deliberately just prune off what's behind that big nasty thing. And that can lead to catastrophic problems in itself. So to give you one example, again, to do with the Battle of France. So in September 1939, so this is 8 months before the catastrophic loss in the Battle of France, a lot of Hitler's key divisions were off to the east invading Poland. The French were more than capable at that point of conducting an offensive that could have gone into Germany, captured key industrial areas that were really very poorly defended at that point. But they absolutely, they just simply did not want to think about what it would mean if they started that kind of offensive war. And so they ignored, even though there are often, better things behind those initially bad options, they ignored them. Just as like you might, for example, with one might with a spouse or a boss, you think I'll put off phoning them, even though to tell them some bad news, even though actually that might be the better option, overall, if you could look past that initially bad option. So we have just lots of ways that our brains work, that they have to work in order to make the world manageable, to make us able to function as well as we do, which is amazing. But inevitably, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Everything brings limitations, and it's just exactly the same thing with our brain. It's incredible, and the way it works incredibly also has limitations.
No, I appreciate the kind of clear examples that you bring in from kind of historical context. So let me, I'll ask a follow-on question, then I want to kind of recap what we've covered so far, and then I want to dive a little bit more into kind of the artificial intelligence moment that we're in. So I mean, we've already talked about how AI models in some, well, not in some ways, but AI models are modeled after human mental models. But should we be concerned? Are there risks and based on your exposure to kind of the cutting edge here of AI models not aligning with human mental models? And are there challenges or concerns that we should be thinking about as the technology develops, and especially in kind of fast moving context?
It's a brilliant question. And it's a question that, so I have a slightly different take on that question to most people. So I think, the first thing to say is that, exactly, you're talking about the alignment problem. So that's what people often describe it as an AI. So this is, we build an AI. How do we know that it's going to do what we want it to do? Okay. Now, the first thing to say is this is not new, right? This is not a new problem. So to give you an example, you know, to give you an example from AI, so you've got a speedboat. This is one that's well known. You have you have an AI controlling a speedboat, and on a little computer game, and basically what it discovered is that it could actually get the most points by just zooming around in the middle of the course and blowing things up and crashing and burning and all the rest of it, right? Now, what they were trying to do was get it to the end of the course, but instead it found a different way to fulfill its objective function, to fulfill its objectives, and it did that by cheating, essentially, right? Or the other example people often give is about paperclips. You have a giant AI that's extremely powerful. You say, "Oh, I want you to build paperclips," and what it discovers is the best way to build more and more and more paperclips is to turn everything around it into paperclip manufacturing stuff. So it kills all of humanity in order to, build more and more and more paperclip making capabilities. So, what is that about? So that is about you have a function and it's not aligned to what we really want. What we wanted with the paperclip model, the machine, was like something that made good cheap paperclips of a reasonable amount for us. What we wanted with the speedboat was a speedboat that would, speed through the course well. But this is something that happens all over the shop, right? So, the Soviet Union had all sorts of ludicrous people finding creative ways to game the system within the Soviet Union that didn't produce anything valuable or useful, but was just a way of getting more money for themselves or more status or more power or whatever. And in the end, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed because it was people were optimizing the wrong things. Right, they were achieving the objective functions, but they weren't aligned with what the Soviet Union wanted, which was to make a better, more prosperous world for communism and for the people who lived in communist countries. And it's the same thing with, a lot of lobbyists or lawyers, or whatever it might be. You create a set of structures and then people game the system, right? You can get very rich on Wall Street by being someone who helps people dodge their taxes, which is essentially gaming the system. So it's not a new thing. And to some extent, it is, I think it's impossible to set exactly the right objectives for an AI. Okay, because, how do we even know exactly what the right objectives are in our lives, right? So if we're talking about now something that is a super intelligent AI, it is at least as intelligent as us. What precisely is the ultimate goal of my life? And how exclusively should I do something like a paperclip machine? Should I follow that goal exclusively? For example, only working and spending absolutely no time with my family or whatever the other things might be. So I think what we end up with is, and there's a lot of discussions about how should we work out what objective function, what is it that we want the AI to achieve? And I think that is important. But actually, I think much more important than that is trying to make the AI wiser. Okay, so it needs to lift its eyes and say, the speedboat going around the center of the course, step back and say, what am I trying to achieve here? Am I really supposed to be just running around in the middle of the course, like crashing into stuff and burning things? Or am I trying to get to the end of the course, right? Or the paperclip machine, do they really want me to kill them all in order to build more paperclips for them? Now, we as humans have that capability to introspect, right? That's one of a range of different things we have that enables us to make wiser choices. So we can, for example, build a range of different, bit like the work that Demis was doing on memories and so on. We have a range of different memories that we can find and combine. Are we in the run up to World War I? Are we in the run up to World War II? We can put those memories next to each other and then compare them. And we can introspect. So, and we can say, how good is our set of knowledge? How confident am I that I'm right in this case? All of those things. There are lots of things that we have, the machinery we have for wisdom. Another thing is, what is our ultimate purpose? So our brain is hierarchical. So by that, what I mean is that that we have lower level features of the world. So, for example, you have 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. That's a face. You also have arms and legs, and so on. And you're a human body, and whatever. And I'm looking at you in an office. You're a person in an office, right? So it's hierarchical. And I'm now looking at the Zoom thing, and there are a variety of things in the Zoom. We have a hierarchical set of things in our brain. That's how our brain works. It's hierarchical. So when we're understanding causes of things in the world, and we use our hierarchical models, so I have a model of you, and I have a set of hierarchical causes. You're having this call with me, partly because you work in this program and you thought it was interesting. And then up above that is, you have a job and you want to do well in your job. And then up above that is you want the job to whatever, right up to the point, whatever the ultimate point of your life is. So what is the ultimate point of your life? And I think most of us would say that we don't want to be too exclusive about that. So actually we balance different things. And again, that is something that is part of what makes us wise. And actually, this is one of the reasons why I'm optimistic for the future, is that I think we have incredible machinery in our own brains for making us wise. I think we can actually enhance that. For example, our ability to self-reflect, our ability to know ourselves better through reading books about neuroscience, through techniques like asking other people to critique us, or reflecting on our own thoughts. There are all sorts of ways we can improve our metacognition, or thinking about thinking, that can help make us wiser, getting a broader range of analogies that we can compare and contrast against each other. All of these things can make us wiser. And I think, hopefully, yes, our abilities to destroy ourselves and destroy others spiral upwards, and it will be the same with AI. But if we can build in that AI the ability to make wiser choices, the processes by which it can make wiser choices, I think that could be a route to dealing with the what you described, the alignment problem, how we can stop a super intelligent AI turning us all into paper clips.
I almost feel like that's the hopeful note to end on, but I will ask another question, because I think that's really, really powerful, which is around, you hit on a lot of important points there, and I think that are important for those of us working in policy or policy adjacent, in think tanks, as we think about the growth of this technology, but also those who are sitting in the companies who are driving the pace of innovation today. And I think you hit on kind of the idea of, or I'll call it the idea of guardrails, or thinking about guardrails as AI models are being developed. So I'll just ask maybe broadly, and this is to others in the audience, what are, and you hit on them already, but what are some ethical considerations, kind of the key ethical considerations that you would posit to all of us thinking about the growth of the AI market, and maybe this applies to other emerging technologies as well, but that should accompany these innovations. And I think thinking about how the brain, our understanding of the brain should play into that as well. Kind of what ethical considerations would you posit for the broader community, including how companies who are working at the cutting edge should be taking those ethical considerations into account?
That's a good. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, there are so what should those companies, working at the cutting edge, do? So, fundamentally, that's a question of morality when you start asking an ought question, what should they do? So I think that so what have we learned about the human brain and morality? So ultimately, like, the single biggest finding from neuroscience for morality is that we don't have some kind of single specialized module for moral decision making. What we actually have is we use the same neural machinery used for other decisions, and we use that to work out what we should do in moral decisions, like basically. And it's this, and the type of machinery I was describing for wisdom, which involves things like consciousness, so our ability to introspect, to think about what's going on, to think about what's arising in our consciousness, and so on. All of those to be reflective and to ask, is this the right thing that we should be doing? I think that is, that's something that we should be building into AI, and also that those people should be asking themselves. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, you ask a really good question. So someone like Sam Altman, who clearly just wants to, there's like you're probably familiar with the story The Lorax, and there's a chap in that. He's very clever. He's and he wants to make thneeds, which is a thingamabob that everybody needs. And so he builds a factory and he chops down all these trees and he builds big. He's very diligent. He's very family minded. He gets all of his other, like family members in to come and build more and more and more stuff. He's very, very clever. And he builds more and more and more things, and he biggers and biggers and biggers and biggers. He's biggering and biggering and biggering. But then ultimately, that's catastrophic. And he destroys the environment. His family all leave, and he's like a sad, lonely old guy sitting in his thing. And I think that is unfortunately where we will end up if people do not show some restraint and wisdom, of the type that that Winston Churchill argued for in a military context. And ultimately, if people refuse to show wisdom and restrain themselves, then they have to be restrained. And it's exactly the same thing. So if you look at the military, for example, so one of the problems for the in Germany, right? So you look at Germany in 1870. Most people don't know this, but the Prussians won a war against France in 1870. Now, how did they do that? They beat them on the battlefield, right? And there's this brilliant German general called von Moltke, and the Germans had this thing called the General Staff, and it was really good. And they beat the French. They'd beaten them militarily. They'd beaten them, but then von Moltke refused to stop basically prosecuting the war against France. He just said, my job is military. I'm going to carry on doing military operations against the French. But it took Otto von Bismarck, the politician, to step back and say, look, actually, we need to stop, because if we don't, we will not be able to finish the war militarily in enough time, quickly enough to stop the British getting involved, and then we could lose. And so Otto von Bismarck stopped the war and overruled or enabled the overruling of the military leaders, and brought the war to a successful conclusion. And Germany was very successful. Now, and Germany was formed. Now, subsequently, the German military became overmighty, and ultimately, the German military ceased to listen adequately to its political masters, and it brought catastrophe on the German people. And so I think that if, for example, these leaders don't show wisdom, and I think they should show wisdom, eventually the whole point of a system with multiple different nodes of power, I don't want to get down, I really like that book, Breakneck. It's almost as good as my book. But I'm not saying that everyone should be blockers at all. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. We need to have models and leaders, good leaders, use those models to create enormously powerful visions for other people to follow. And you have wonderful leaders like Eisenhower and Churchill and all the rest of it. Enormously wonderful, brilliant things. Build. All in favor of that. And in addition to that, if people go too far, then they need to be stopped. Just as American politicians have ultimately stopped military leaders when they have become overmighty in the past. For example, Harry Truman eventually was able to sack Douglas MacArthur, a man who, as someone else on the Joint Chiefs said, or someone on the Joint Chiefs said, he just refused to follow the orders. And I think it will be the same with these people of Silicon Valley. If they go too far, then they will have to be stopped. But I don't think we're there yet. I think they've got, I mean, they're doing wonderful, brilliant work inventing the future. So right now, I think we're okay.
No, I think that's really, really helpful. So let me recap our conversation just a bit, and then I want to give you a chance to draw out the key things that you want all audiences who are going to find your book relevant. These are policy, military, and tech experts, and everyone in between to take away from your book. But we have talked about the brain as a catalyst for war and peace, and this is just a high level summary of all the things we've covered. We've talked about brain models and how we should think about them fundamentally, and mapping of the brain. We've talked about just some of the key things that stuck out to me. The fact that we can never not account for, we have to always account for the fog of war, even with technological advancements. We can't ever forget that. I really have enjoyed our conversation around artificial intelligence and all of the lessons that we can learn from your book as we're in an incredible age of innovation related to morality and ethics. And I'll just make the last point, and I'll say lessons from the Lorax that you have highlighted that I think are really powerful. But we're not in a place yet where the old man is by himself at the end of the book, but it's important for us to keep those sorts of lessons in mind as we all work together as a greater community to harness these technologies for the greater good. Okay, we've covered much more in between, but I'll turn it back to you, Nick. What are the key things that you want everyone to take away from your book and apply?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the first crucial thing is about war. And that's obviously, a major theme of the book. It's fundamentally a book about war and the brain. And that is, we have to be, to understand, to gain better self-knowledge of why humans fight wars, and also why humans win and lose wars. If we focus on just one aspect or the other, that is an incomplete picture. So a lot of people focus on why do we fight wars? You read, wonderful books by Robert Sapolsky, for example, or Steven Pinker, but they're dangerously incomplete pictures. Because, for example, Steven Pinker, it's like, oh, don't worry, guys, the arc of history is towards peace, so we don't really need to worry about fighting wars. Well, as he stated after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, well, I've certainly, or words to this effect, I've certainly changed my my opinion on the subjective probability of war to dictators. Well, I mean, a lot of people could have told him that before he argued that we didn't need to worry about these things. So we need a more complete picture that doesn't just ask why people fight, and it doesn't just ask how we win and lose. Because equally, if we're just asking, if we're just obsessed with how can we make sure that we win, how can we make sure that we don't lose, then we can start unnecessary wars that we simply, or we build, enormously powerful capabilities that become self-fulfilling prophecies. So we need to balance those two things. We need to understand why humans fight and why humans lose and win wars. And it sounds, in terms of why humans fight, I think we fight in part because of the way our brains work. And sadly, there are many drivers. I showed that picture at the beginning. From the brainstem through to the frontal pole, there is really nothing about our brains that suggests that we don't have drives towards conflict. Now, that said, that's far from all there is to humanity, and so we really need to be optimistic, because I think that hopefully we can reduce the probability of war. We can make a more peaceful world, and if we do need to fight, then I think we in the democracies are very strong. We've won before, and I'm very confident that we can win again in the future. And in order to do that, especially in a world where I think it's really important to remember that, unlike in May 1940, the Allies had more trained men, more tanks and more guns and more planes than the Germans, right? This time, if we were to go to war with China, China massively outproduces us materially now. China produces as much as manufactures as much as the next 4 or even 9 countries in the world combined. It has over half the world's industrial robots. It is an enormously powerful manufacturing country. And if we were going to go into a war with them, certainly a prolonged war, we would be the ones at a material disadvantage. So we have to use our brains. Otherwise, I don't see any way that we can possibly win. And I think we can do that. And I am optimistic we can do that. And, I think a lot of that relies on our self-knowledge. So that's the first thing, is about war. The second thing is about technology. And I say this because obviously a lot of your listeners are interested in technology. If we want to know where technologies are going, a lot of that is going, is going to be helpfully predicted by what we know about the brain. So, for example, people get very excited now about humanoid robots, but I know people talk about humanoid robots many years ago. That's just a good way for. There are a wide variety of reasons to do with how humans operate in the world. Our models involve a combination of physical models. We have an orchestra of models in our brain that involve physical models of the world's physics, and visual models, and motor models, and maps, language models, planning models, and all the rest of it. Now, by an amazing coincidence, it's suddenly become fashionable to rediscover this integration of these different models, and that could be, and I think probably will be, where we get the next big leap. So we had a big leap around 2012 in AI. We had a big leap around, it depends exactly when you would say it, but around 2022, that came before that with generative AI. And I think the next big leap will probably be to do with these, with robots, essentially, with models that involve robots, and potentially particularly human or humanoid robots. And we get a lot of that from just how the brain works. Or another example being augmented reality. Everyone made fun of Mark Zuckerberg, and potentially rightly so, with his glasses and all the rest of it. But the thing is that the way our perceptual system works is that it is the way we perceive the world. We perceive a controlled model of the world, and that controlled model of the world is warped to be useful for us to act. So augmented reality, in my opinion, will be enormously important in the future once we get the technology right, because that is an extension of how our human perceptual system works anyway. And you're seeing that once you have, the military often pioneers a lot of these things because it can spend a lot more money per person doing it. And, augmented reality is already there in the F-35 and so on and so forth. So I think, it tells us a lot about our futures technologically. And then I just say that this also matters for everyday life. So we all get involved in conflicts in our workplaces. We all make mistakes. We all have to make decisions. We have to make smarter choices, hopefully less unwise choices. I talked about the Lorax, but another great example of people who are very clever, but they're not wise, is the Big Bang Theory. Those guys, they're very clever guys, but they keep getting into pickles, getting into messes, because they do not think ahead for what are the unintended consequences of their very, very clever, but extremely often very unwise plans. And so I think we need to think about wisdom, think about self-reflection, and how we can learn about ourselves as humanity, and we can learn about ourselves as individuals. And neuroscience can help us do both of those things. And that's enormously powerful. Self-knowledge is power. And that makes me optimistic for the future.
Thank you very much, Nick. I think my, maybe not slogan, but a overarching takeaway, even across all of those important key takeaways that you just noted, is use our brains. That applies to war, technology, and everyday life. So that's very easy for us all to remember, if neuroscience is not easy. So thank you very, very much for this awesome conversation with medical, policy, technological implications, and for present and future conflicts. So most importantly, we encourage everyone to grab a copy of Warhead to learn more. It's going to be available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and bookshop.org, and this is on October 7th.
Yeah.
When it will be available. And if you're interested in following Dr. Nick Wright's work more closely, you can follow him on LinkedIn, and I'm sure other places. And then we also hope that you can follow CSIS STP, Strategic Technologies Program, on X at CSIS_tech, and on LinkedIn, CSIS Strategic Technologies Program, for more content and more fascinating conversations like this. And we thank you all for joining this afternoon.